David and Ridgewood.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Oh, we can hear you just fine.
I'm good.
Thank you for your patience.
Absolutely no problem.
Thank you, Frank.
My first call was back in February, and it went pretty well. I am a practicing Christian. I'm a Catholic. I did like the joke on the way in. It's nice to meet Don Baker. How are you?
Hey, how's it going?
Good. Obviously, the answer to what you guys are saying with truth is that we have not yet discovered it. Like, as far as with the creation of the universe, it's kind of like a detective solving a murder on the first day. You know, we haven't yet discovered. You know what I mean? We're still piecing together. I mean, does that make sense?
Sure. So on that foundation,
science is hard work.
Right? Are you also saying that Catholicism doesn't know the truth about this?
Well, yes, that is correct. I mean, now.
So why would you, David? Why would you identify as a Catholic, which I presume means you believe what Catholicism has to say about this, if you don't think that they have a demonstration of truth?
That is a very good question, and I'm kind of in a part of my life where I'm looking at the facts. You know, okay. I'm observing a lot of things, religious claims, the claims of atheists, your show, books by Dawkins and Hitchens and stuff like that.
Good for you. It's good. It's good to question.
So, what did you have a question for us today, or?
Yes, I want to say the question, and then I want to elaborate with like 3 or 4 sentences. So
sure,
I'm going to say the question. The question is basically, how unreasonable do you think it is for someone to believe in God? Now, if we were to run through all of the issues, I'd probably be with you. Like, Matt, I know you support gay rights. You know, I support gay rights. You know, you want a separation of church and state. I want the same thing. I don't want there to be oppression from religion. You know, but I mean, if someone looks at the facts and says, it is my opinion that there's a deity behind this, like, how unreasonable do you think that is? Like, on a scale of 1 to 10,
so,
do you think it's like crazy, or?
So it would, first of all, we'd need to define God, and we'd need to define exactly what it is that they believe, because not all God beliefs and not all religions are equivalent. But I'd say that it's not something that we could easily even put a number on it. It's something I've talked about before, is that when you're trying to, calculate the probabilities of something being true, if you have 0 examples of it actually being true, you can't even, determine it. So when I say that I find something unreasonable or irrational, I don't try to quantify very often how irrational it is. Like, I mean, for example, I think Scientology, I think it's probably, and I'm going to get in trouble here, but I think it's probably less rational to believe Scientology or Mormonism, where we have some evidence of fraud in the creation, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily untrue. And it also, you have to consider how unbelievable are their claims. And to me, all the God claims and all the claims of specific religions, not every claim, but I mean the bulk of what comprises this, they're all unreasonable, and it is irrational to accept any of them until such time as there's evidence for them that would warrant belief. So I don't know.
I want to throw out something too.
Crazy, though.
I want to throw out something too. Often theists will say, talk about belief in God, and why would you pick one God over the other? Mankind has invented thousands and thousands of gods, and why is one God any more special than the other? Or was your question about belief in God in general, a God?
Yeah, it kind of was pointing to that. I mean, I do understand the argument, like why this God or why this sect of religion over that. That's a very good point. Would you agree that sometimes evidence is subjective? Like, for example,
no.
There's a difference between, let's say, 2 examples. Like, if I'm trying to determine that someone broke into my house, like, if I have a surveillance camera showing the person breaking in and taking things, or if I don't have a surveillance camera, but I see that maybe the window's pried open and there's stuff missing, maybe there's a footprint, you know what I mean? Like,
so the evidence itself isn't subjective. Your assessment of it is subjective, and you can come to various conclusions. But you're really talking about, the quality and quantity of evidence for the conclusion that you're reaching. And so, if you've got a video camera, that's really high quality evidence where you can watch somebody break in. Whereas we may have to, when we look at other evidence, for example, my home was broken into in November. I didn't have a video camera on it, but I am incredibly confident that it was broken into because there was a rock laying on the floor in the back sliding glass door was broken, and there was a bunch of stuff missing. The bedroom was trashed. I can't think of any other explanation for this, and I have a massive amount of similar scenarios. The police seemed pretty convinced too that it was a break-in. Am I absolutely positive? No. It could have been gremlins. But what I will say, actually, I am pretty positive and pretty close to absolutely positive, because whatever happened, my home was broken into and in disarray and things were missing. That's by definition a burglary.
Okay. Yeah,
whether it happened by ghost or real person, I don't know.
That's pretty funny. Sometimes though, things are very hard to see. Like, for example, with we're trying to prove God or the existence of a God, and I did meet God in general before. Like, for example, I actually met someone not too long ago that was unaware that the Earth was spinning, and it can be hard to explain that to people, because we don't actually feel it spinning.
Sure.
Is it true that the Earth is spinning 800 miles an hour to 1,000 miles an hour? But we don't feel that, and there are people that actually don't know that, and it's hard to explain it to them. You know what I mean? Like, sometimes I think that the evidence for God is going to be something very hard to see.
So the most powerful being in the world is undetectable, but we can measure the weight of an electron?
Yeah, so I mean, you talk about, for example, demonstrating that the Earth is actually spinning, and there's the old anecdote that, what would it look like if the sun actually did rise rather than it was the product of the Earth spinning on its axis? And the point being that from the relative frame of reference, it would look exactly the same. And yet somehow we have managed to demonstrate conclusively that the Earth does in fact spin on an axis. There may be people who are unaware of it, and I know that there's the Flat Earth Society who have very different models of the universe, but we have demonstrated this to an incredibly high degree of precision, to the point that we even know, how it's slowing down and all these other things. The point is that the time to believe that the Earth is spinning on its axis is when the preponderance of evidence demonstrates that this is most likely the correct model. And it's curious, and this is the point I think Don was making, that we can do this for all sorts of things, including knowing how many years it takes Pluto to traverse the solar system, even though it hasn't happened in the time frame since we've discovered Pluto.
Yeah.
And yet there's this God, or some version of God, that 60-75% of the population of the planet believe in, and many of them think they have good, sound reasons for believing in, and yet we can't seem to demonstrate this at the level that we can for these other claims. Now, the excuse that I often get, and I got it in email today, is, I got it from George when we were talking about this in email. He was saying we have faith in science, and that's the same as his faith in God. And that's preposterous, because even if you used a definition of faith to say, I believe something when I don't have absolute certainty, like the burglary or the Earth spinning, the reason that I believe that is nothing at all like the reasons people give for believing in God. And George, in his email, I hate to pick on him when he's not here, said that he believes because he was taught, and because when he looks around at the world, this is the conclusion that he reaches.
Makes sense.
And that we
level,
believed
right?
because we trusted the scientists. Well, no, I don't trust scientists. I trust the evidence that's available for all of us to examine.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense and everything. I wanted to. I've been putting together something basically. This is my opinion on what atheists want for the world and everything, and you guys can feel free to correct or add to it. First of all, they want no violence from religion. Like, for example, there was a scene in. You guys talked about it earlier in the show, the Holy Wars, of course, and there was a scene in Slumdog Millionaire where there was fighting between these primitive people over their religion and everything.
Well, that's
And
certainly
some
one
people-
of the things that motivates me, as on a personal level, is the harm that religion does. Is something that I think is unnecessary, and something we could fix pretty easily, if only, and address and not have to have it anymore. and move on to more serious problems that will take more work.
Yeah, and I think that my opposition to violence as a way of solving disagreements doesn't stem so much from my atheism as it does from my humanism. So I don't want to put that out as the atheism is just about a God belief. That's it. Everything else is an addition to that. It may be consistent with it. Once you discover that you live in a world, or you're convinced that you live in a world without God, you still have to make decisions. And it's a lot of atheists come to a lot of the same conclusions because we're using similar methods. Most of the people who identify as atheists are, skeptics and critical thinkers and people who value science and evidence.
Right. There is an atheist movement, and you will find some commonalities among those folks who identify themselves as atheists, but the definition is rather restrictive.
Yeah, we're not a hive mind. I'm sure there are atheists who probably relish religious violence.
Right. Well, for the most part, most of the atheist organizations. The other thing is, it seems like that, and I would be opposed to this also. Like, I don't know how to describe this. Like statements, like for example, sometimes when talking about, should we have gay marriage, the religious right will say, oh, God, that is against God. Well, there's a problem with that. First of all, it's arrogant to say the mind of the divine, and the other problem is we're not entirely sure that God exists, so we certainly shouldn't be making statements about what it wants and everything.
And my response to that sounds awesome, except that I would point out that even if a God existed and we knew that a God existed, it doesn't change what's right. See, if a God actually existed and we knew it existed, and this God made a pronouncement that we need to kill all the homosexuals, that would still be immoral.
That's true. I wanted to ask a question about burden of proof. Now, Matt, you do a very good job of there's two things that have helped me understand burden of proof. There's the courtroom example and the bubble gum machine example. My question is, obviously, if I'm dealing with just a basic atheist and I say there's a God, 100% of the burden of proof is on me. But if I'm dealing with someone that, if I have this correct, an anti-theist who proclaims there is no God, what would be they acquire some of the burden of proof, right?
Sure. Well, no. Okay, first of all, if you're trying to convince someone of anything, there is an implied burden of proof there because I'm trying to change somebody's mind. When we're talking about it at the broader level of a claim about something, it is the positive claim that has a burden of proof. And this is just about what's rational to believe, not necessarily what you're trying to convince somebody else of. So I am an atheist, and I defend atheism, and I defend the weak/soft atheist position because I don't want to unnecessarily shift the burden of proof. Because if I take the hard or strong atheist position, which I've also called anti-theism, that there are no gods, that does put a burden of proof on me. And my concern isn't so much whether or not I can actually meet that burden of proof, because for the definitions that I use, I think I can. It's that if I fail to meet that burden of proof, people who don't understand the burden of proof in the larger sense will assume that this is evidence in favor of their God. The fact that somebody hasn't been able to debunk God means that their belief in God is more reasonable, and that's simply false.
Muddies the waters.
I not only don't believe in Bigfoot, actually we'll go with Loch Ness Monster. I not only don't believe that there's not a Loch Ness Monster, or that there is a Loch Ness Monster, I believe there isn't. Because the preponderance of evidence shows that it's most probably not true. Now, can I prove there isn't? No. And so I want to make sure that the claim of there is a Loch Ness Monster maintains its burden of proof. And at a minimum, all I have to do, like in the not guilty thing, is say, I don't believe that. I'm still open to evidence, even if I believe that it's false.
Right. Now that makes sense. It's funny that I have a friend up here in New Jersey who's very into science, and his claim on the you can't disprove it. He says you can't disprove that I hooked up with Cindy Crawford.
It's one of those things where they're teaching kids in creationism courses and homeschools and stuff to ask this question over and over again. Were you there? Were you there? Were you there? When anybody talks about millions of years ago or the fossil record and all this, were you there? Were you there? And somebody, I think, posted on my Facebook something I found kind of amusing, which I might have referenced before, suggesting that we say, yeah, as a matter of fact, I was.
And you can't prove it, right?
You can't prove that I wasn't, as a way of demonstrating the absurdity of that position.
I wanted to ask another question about the possibility of there being a heaven. In the Northeast, we had that very unfortunate thing with the schools in Connecticut, and of course, no one wants anything like that to happen. But like, when I see a tragedy, like, of course, when you see a tragedy, and let's say there are victims that died before we think they should. Like, would you prefer that there was a heaven for them to go to?
Our preference has nothing to do with it.
Well, yeah.
It's wishful thinking at best, right?
So it depends. Would I prefer that nobody ever actually died? Sure. If there was some viable model where nobody actually died, I think that'd probably be preferable, because I'd like to continue existing.
It's like the transhumanism.
As
right?
Don pointed out, my preference has absolutely nothing to do with it. And what I think I would prefer is that in the absence of confirmation of an afterlife, and given the wealth of evidence that we have that seems to imply that when I'm dead, I would prefer that we teach people about reality so that they can work to treat people right in the life that they experience, and not live their life as if they're going to be able to make amends in an afterlife, or that after they're dead they'll get the answers, or that after they're dead everything will be fine. Let's work on getting the answers now and making everything fine now, and if it turns out there's an afterlife, bonus.
Okay, that makes sense. Another thing my friend said, he was talking after 9/11, when there was a lot of talk of Muslim suicide bombers and how they think after they die they're going to get virgins in heaven, and he used to say they don't even get a chance to be disappointed. I would always say, well, wouldn't you like there to be a chance for them to be disappointed? But before I go, I want to say that it seems to me that there are two very important misconceptions that the public have about both atheism and science. First of all, there's with evolution, and I'm sure I'm not saying something you haven't heard of. A lot of people think that evolution states that we came from apes, like that there were apes and from that came human. And of course, and I'll be honest, up until about a year and a half ago, I thought that too. But of course, upon further study, we had a common ancestry, and it goes back and back. And
right. We and dogs have common ancestry.
Right, exactly. Right. And actually, if I'm not mistaken, all living things.
Yeah, I have a common ancestor with the carrot.
Right. Exactly. Like we came from cells and everything.
But when people say, we came from apes or we came from monkeys, they're not entirely incorrect. The closest common ancestor between us and the other great apes is something that would be
ape-like,
recognizably ape-like, and identified as such.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And my understanding, but obviously the apes are like we kind of split off, and the other group evolved and we evolved. A lot of people don't understand that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And to the credit of the Catholic Church, at least the Catholic Church has managed to do a somewhat decent job of accepting and supporting evolution. So kudos to them. Now I wish they'd work to become a less criminal organization when it comes to hiding priests who are molesting kids, but I'd also, there's about 20 or 30 other policies that I wish that they'd change too, that are result in people dying necessarily because of the Catholic Church's perverse position on prophylactics and condoms. Yeah. People dying over this.
Like AIDS in Africa or whatever.
Yeah, and it's just bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course there's arguing in the church about that, and I think that they should just let priests marry. I mean, it seems kind of bizarre that they shouldn't. Now, the other misconception, I think you guys do a good job of this, is of course the thought that atheism is proclaiming that there is no God. And of course, that's not atheism. It's or at least for the most part, it's waiting to see evidence. Then there's nothing wrong. Actually, I wanted to run a question about the argument from First Cause. I forget if I already asked this.
Sure, but this got to be it, because there's 3 other lines of people waiting. So let's hit it and hit it pretty quick.
I got you. The argument for First Cause says that nothing comes into existence without a cause, but if the universe came into existence without a cause, then that could qualify the universe as being supernatural and thus possibly created by a god. Like, what's your take on that?
That's not the First Cause.
Well, it's if you look at quantum mechanics, there are uncaused events, and the Big Bang Theory is about the universe at a time when it was so small, it was a quantum thing, and so there's really not a contradiction there in that sense. If we have things like spontaneous radioactive decay that doesn't have a cause,
we don't,
in that sense.
We don't know enough about the origins of the universe to make proclamations about what can or can't happen. I think is kind of the first thing. And as Tracy's pointed out repeatedly, this idea of something from nothing is itself bizarre because you can't. There's not a nothing on which to act. I mean, and you can't act upon nothing. So we're having difficulties with the language. But if we can't get back beyond the Planck time, then everything's just a guess. And so if we're going to guess, which could be interesting, what reason do we have for thinking that the answer is, there's a supernatural thinking agent who consciously made a decision? I mean, of all the possible things, maybe universes maybe the multiverse, idea is correct, and you've got universes popping up for natural reasons. Or maybe because time breaks down, the notion of a beginning or a time before is absolutely absurd. So there's a lot of problems with the first cause argument and with the Kalam cosmological argument and things like that. At the end of the day, even if we granted that the universe had a beginning and it must have been caused by something that exists outside of space-time, what possible justification could anybody have for thinking that that something was a god? It doesn't even have to be, we've shown no requirement that it think, that it be a conscious agent acting, that it's not some process that transcends our understanding of natural laws because the natural laws don't apply at that time.
Right, so it's a classic God of the gap sort of thing, right?
Yeah, it's basically, you don't know, and you can't prove I'm wrong, and so I'm going to cling to this belief because to me, it offers the best explanation. But the reason that it appears to offer the best explanation when it offers no explanation is because it's a panacea. We've constructed a God and given it this ability to do all sorts of things that we can't even fathom. So of course it's an explanation. Magic is an explanation. It has no explanatory power, though. It's you're trying to solve a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery, and you get nowhere with that.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I will let you get to the call. Thanks for taking my call.
Thanks,
Don.
David.
It was very nice to meet you.
Thanks so much.